because I'm reading 1984 right now. I find this book fascinating. And when you're reading that book, you certainly put yourself in the perspective of Winston, the small guy that's, swept up into this system. And he's starting to see that the inner party and the outer party, maybe not things that he wants to agree with. How are you certain that you're just not a part of the inner party and you're just convinced that the system, that this is a temple and everybody should celebrate at it, as opposed to this is massively oppressing other people and that we just aren't hearing, or when we look at it, we see a castle, and when they look at it, they see prison gates?
Sure. Well, I think, look, that examination is always healthy to have at any moment in history, no matter what society you're in. But I think if you take a step back and again, this is why I think understanding the historical context in which we live, most people have lived, in a Hobbesian kind of world where it was nasty, brutish, and short. The way of the world was extreme poverty and a lot of violence. Okay. So what we've carved out in this world in the last few hundred years is very unique. It's a system where people can live their lives and they can choose. Titles don't matter. You can persuade someone to marry you. I mean, think about that. That did not exist. You can persuade someone to actually marry you. You can be willing to be persuaded. So my belief is that in openness with the structure, and not a predetermined path necessarily, but the idea that we are living in a society with some guardrails that provide security for people to speak their own minds and live their own life. If they want to be a farmer, great. If they want to be an astronaut, great. And this has really come to light. We sued with the coronavirus here. We sued China. We were the first state to sue the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party. Yeah. And if you read our complaint, which was the first of its kind to really lay all this out in one document of what they knew, when they knew it, what they did to cover it up, the lies that they told, and the disastrous impact it's had across the globe that we're still living with. What you see is the real danger of what an authoritarian regime can really do. That's not open, that's not honest. And so we mentioned earlier that our structure of government and our system to allow people the maximum amount of liberty is to disperse power. And it's really that space, and I think this is an important concept, between the individual and the state. That space in between is where we really live our lives. And we have cultural pluralism. People belong. I mean, interestingly, Tocqueville comes to America. If anybody's never read it, Democracy in America, it's a big read, but don't read it all at once. It's a travel log. So read it in these different chunks. But Tocqueville comes to America in the 1820s, 1830s, in the early part of the 19th century, because for a lot of Europe, we weren't really free until after the War of 1812, and they say, okay, America's its own place now. So we are our own country. And there's all this economic dynamism happening here. There's religious freedom, right? And so Europe thought we're a bunch of religious malcontents that came here. We fought off the British in some big upset.
Oh, I never thought about the fact that the Europeans wouldn't actually know. You can't just get on Google Maps or open up a textbook. You don't have any idea what's going on over there.
Right, so Tocqueville comes here, gets on a boat, comes here, and he's expecting to think, what's going on in America. And the belief, was that, we just had better bureaucrats than they had in Europe. And he found out that wasn't the case. And you went to Washington, D.C., and there wasn't a lot of innovation, and it was a swamp. And the joke is, of course, that not much has changed in a couple hundred years. But he went out to many of the several states. And what he found was that the uniqueness of America, what made America thrive, what was making America this emerging superpower, and he's very predictive in the rise of America, and this is back before anybody considered us to be a superpower, right? Was that we're a nation of joiners, right? We have this cultural pluralism. We belong to a church. Nowadays, the Rotary Club. We've got all these different interests. And by the way, that is the real danger with identity politics, is it just sort of crystallizes people to one thing. And we're way more complex people than that. And we all have different interests. I'm a dad, I'm a Cardinal fan, I'm a Republican.
Things that transcend what you were born with and allow your intellect to be the thing that connects with other people, and your interests and your passions and that's what allows you to transcend where was I born and how do I join this fabric that is a community,
and have that commonality with people and have shared values, right? And so that space between the state and the individual is maximized in America, right? Because we don't have this, and we want to guard, at least my political philosophy is, you want to guard against the oppressive state to tell you what to do and to tell you what to say and to tell you what to wear, because in that freedom that we have, we're allowed to be ourselves. We can find, people of different interests, learn that, your neighbor doesn't have to have all the same beliefs. They may not have the same yard sign you have up, but they're a good person, right? And they work hard, and I will, go to bat for my neighbor and build a sense of community. And that's what Tocqueville found in America. I still believe that's true today, but there are challenges, right? There's trouble on the horizon. You've got to, people are trying to drown out dissent. Those mediating institutions that are really important, as Tocqueville talks about, like church, these nonprofit organizations that people are involved in, they're shrinking. Some of that is the technology age, and you can sort of correlate that with a sense of loneliness and people, there's a lot of things that are happening. And again, this disruptive age that we live in, we're in a fascinating time. And it's true, it's very true to say it's unprecedented in human history, the time that we live in, the level of disruption, economic disruption, social disruption. So it's a challenge for us, but I think we're up for it.
Well, the disruption that you're talking about, is a question of, do people believe that they can get justice in this world, right? Whether it's for them or for their community or for the group that they're with. And I remember, so I lived in graduate school with a guy from Afghanistan. He's a Fulbright scholar. And we talked about, he lived there before the Taliban really came in and took over. And he talked about what it was that made it. We have this feeling that all of the villagers hated the Taliban from the moment they showed up, and they didn't want anything to do with them. But those guys were just strong arms. But it turns out, Zubair said that the people would have a problem with somebody stole some land from me, somebody took something from my family, something happened, but they had no judicial system.
Right.
So when the Taliban rolled in, they're like, hey, if you start listening to us for court cases, we'll met out the justice, and whoever decides right or wrong, we will go enact that justice. And the people welcomed it because they had been living in lawlessness, and they were willing to give an authoritarian over lawlessness. And he said, if you gave them that choice again, they'd choose the Taliban again, even for all the terrible things they did to them.
What you're hitting on is, at the core, we talked about political philosophy before the Enlightenment and the American Enlightenment. Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan, right? Leviathan was the beginning of this social contract theory, right? That in order for people to feel safe, they will give up a certain amount of liberty, right? And that's always the tug and the pull of government.
That's what's going on with coronavirus, right?
Right. It's always the tug between the individual and government. But forever, and still to this day, and you're giving an example of in the last decade, 2 decades, right? Of what is.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you liked it, make sure you hit the subscribe button and don't forget to hit that bell. Also, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can always join the Articulate Ventures Network, where people get previews of the show early and also get to meet other Articulate Ventures Network supporters from all over the world. The link is below, or visit articulate.ventures.